Chat.
Okay, I believe it's 10 o'clock, so we'll get started. Hello and welcome to all of you who have joined us for this online media briefing. I'm Olivia from the Australian Science Media Centre. A reminder that today's story is under embargo until 1 minute past midnight on Thursday, the 2nd of September. So today's briefing, it's about the release of the position statement for ATSE. So after the release of the IPCC's most recent climate report, Prime Minister Scott Morrison said technology, not taxes, was the Australian way of solving the climate crisis. But what is that technology and what are the policies needed to make net zero emissions a reality? The Australian Academy of Technology and Engineering, or ATSE, is set to release a position statement called Australia's Technology-Led Transition to Net Zero Emissions. The statement suggests that Australia has the potential to be a world leader in renewable energy generation, low emission and negative emission technologies. They are calling on the federal government to announce immediate and decisive action to reduce Australia's greenhouse gas emissions. Today's briefing centres around ATSE's position statement, discussing the current available technology to meet the net zero goal and what policies are needed. Joining us today are three speakers. So the first speaker is Professor Hugh Bradlow. Hugh is the president of ATSE and an independent non-executive director of Silicon Quantum Computing. Next, we'll hear from Professor Renata Egan. Renata is an Energy Forum Working Group member, co-founder of Solar Analytics, and leads the UNSW activity in the Australian Centre for Advanced Photovoltaics. Next, we'll hear from Dr. John Söderbaum. John is ATSE Energy Forum Chair and the Director of Science and Technology for ACIL. There will be an opportunity for journalists to ask questions of any of the speakers today at the end of the presentations. So you can ask your questions by typing your question into the Q&A box or raise your hand and we will unmute you when the time comes. For those of you who have joined us over the phone, if you do want to ask a question, raise your hand by pressing *9 on the dial pad and we'll be able to unmute you. But please also, when you do ask a question, be sure to include your name and affiliation, that is where you're from, with each question. So we will begin now with Professor Hugh Bradlow. Handing over to you, Hugh.
Thanks, Olivia. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to spring. Let me start off by, if I could have the second slide, please, Olivia. Number 3, actually, sorry. Let me start off by telling you who ATSE is. So we're one of 5 learned academies in Australia. Learned academies represent the elite of the professions because to become a fellow of the Learned Academy, you have to be elected. And our fellows represent technology and engineering across the board. They cover a wide range of disciplines, but including infrastructure, minerals, and energy, amongst others. So why are we releasing this position statement? Well, last year we surveyed our fellows and said, sorry, let me just step back 1 second and say ATSE's mission is to use our expertise to provide guidance to Australia on how we can use technology and engineering to solve complex problems. And last year we asked our fellows to nominate the most important complex problems that we should be working on as an academy. And right at the top came out climate change, followed closely by reducing our emissions. So we decided we would address that through this statement. So what we need to do is we need to recognize, first of all, that climate change is real, anthropogenic climate change is real, and that if we don't take action on it, it represents a clear and present danger to all of us. You just have to read the IPCC report to actually know that. But if that weren't enough, our lived experience over the last few years is showing us that the frequency and ferocity of natural disasters is increasing dramatically. And just to put that in context, I think Ash Wednesday fires were something burnt out about 500,000 hectares, if I remember the numbers correctly. The 2019-2020 fires burnt out 10 million hectares. So we're into territory which is totally uncharted if we actually don't act. And what's more, the IPCC IPCC report makes it clear that we're heading towards a tipping point where we'll see all sorts of disastrous consequences like ice caps melting. And if that's not enough to scare you, there's a website called Coastal Risk Australia. Go and look at it and model. It allows you to model what a sea level rise means to your favorite ski resort. And the results are pretty stark. So we have to act. And if I can go to the next slide, please, Olivia. So what we need to do is we need to effectively do three things, which we're going to discuss today. The first is that the government and the country needs to commit to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. That, I think, is an unequivocal requirement that all countries need to meet, and most countries are stepping up to recognize that requirement. And without that sort of commitment, you don't take the actions that you need in order to get there and to actually mitigate the effects of emissions. Now, if we're going to do that, we have to set ourselves on an ambitious path, and therefore we have to up our interim goals. So if I can go to the next slide, let's talk about our target for 2030. You'll see from this slide that the peak emissions Australia achieved was in 2007. We have set a baseline based on the Paris Agreement for 2005, which is awfully close to the peak. So it's about 628 megatons of carbon dioxide equivalent emissions. And we've only set a goal to reduce that by 26 to 28% in 2030, which takes us down to about 450 odd megatons. Now, we weren't even on track to meet that at the beginning of last year. ATSE actually did an explainer which showed that. And then COVID came along, which now is being claimed as an example of how we've actually improved our emissions. But in fact, that dip in the end of the curve there is the COVID result, not an actual real reduction in the way we are controlling our emissions. So the imperative is there for us to do more. We believe as an academy, there are numbers like 50% being touted as a possible 2030 target. Other countries like Britain have much more ambitious targets. I think Britain's talking about 75% in 2035. So we need to be much more ambitious. And if we do all that, then we will become global leaders and take our place responsibly in the world. Now, one of the arguments we hear is that it can't be done, and it can't be done economically. So I'm going to hand over now to Renata, who's going to show you that it can be done. And then John's going to tell you how it must be done. So with that, I will conclude my section and hand over to Renata. Thank you.
Thank you, Hugh. Following, can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. Following Hugh's statements, most of our international partners are targeting and achieving fast emissions reductions. The US, for instance, has a target of 40% by 2030. We should at least be that ambitious. And the evidence is that that's entirely achievable and affordable. So ATSE has taken a position, or is releasing a position statement that Australia should prioritise the immediate deployment of existing, mature, low carbon technologies, which can make deep cuts to high emitting sectors before 2030. So I'm going to go into that a little bit, unpick some of what those sectors are and the kind of things we can do. But the point is that there are technologies that exist now that we can employ now that are affordable, that will make a big impact. And if we invest in those now, then the transition to net zero by 2050 is much easier. So next slide, please. So in 2020, this graph here shows where our emissions are by sector for the year 2020. And I'm going to focus on the three key areas of electricity, stationary energy, and transport. So electricity is, as we all live and breathe, we rely on electricity, contributes around 33% of our emissions. Stationary energy, which is largely from heating, such as burning gas for heating homes or industrial processes, contributes around 20%, and transport is around 17% of our emissions. We have technologies now that can rapidly reduce emissions in these sectors. Electricity, which is 33%, we are already on track to reach 80% renewables by 2030 in this sector. Solar and wind are widely used across the world, and in fact, Australia is leading in the deployment of solar and wind. We currently deploy more renewables than, or in fact, by a factor of 10 than the global average. The biggest investment in new energy generation in Australia has been Australian households installing solar on their rooftops. In 2020 alone, Australians invested over $3 billion on rooftop solar on homes and businesses, over 350,000 homes and businesses in Australia. And we did this because it's cheaper in the long run. If we maintain our current deployment, rate of deployment, we will reach 80% electrification of electricity by renewables by 2030. And if we can increase our deployment, it'll be possible to have close to 100% renewable electrification by 2030. This investment alone in the technology will not be enough. We'll need to also work on a couple of other technology aspects. One of them is that we need to work on the grid itself for improved security and reliability, and the market operator is getting ready for this. The market operator, AEMO, the Australian Energy Market Operator, has already got plans in place for the East Coast grid to be able to handle 100% renewables by 2025. We also have to invest in and engage with energy storage to make sure that lights stay on when the wind doesn't blow and when the sun doesn't shine. Fortunately, battery technology is advancing at a rapid rate and getting progressively cheaper. This is especially good news for rural and regional communities because local electricity supply and battery storage makes them more resilient and improves reliability. Also, for the long term, Australia is investing in pumped hydro to give us long-term storage and large volumes of storage. So, apologies, give me a second. So on electricity, we have the solutions available and ready to go to 100% renewables. And ATSE supports the ambitious goals of people like the Energy Market Operator to apply the available technology solutions to ensure our emissions get to zero as soon as possible from electricity. At the same time, we need to look to electrify transport to address the 17% of emissions from transport, and heating to address another 20% of emissions. And we can already see what that looks like. There's a worldwide transition at the moment to electric vehicles. Unlike many other technology changes, like mobile phones or cashless transactions, where Australia has been world-class, we've been slow on the uptake for electric vehicles. We need policy and direction and enablers and incentives to encourage investment in electric vehicles. Cars have a road life of around 10 years. So if we act now, over the next 10 years, we can cut significant transport emissions. And at the same time, consumers save money, and as a country, we become less reliant on oil and fuel imports. The last of the three areas that we can address in the near term is stationary energy. Now, stationary energy is principally heating, so it's heating of our homes and it's process heat in industrial processes. And to achieve emissions reductions there, the technology exists again. We can simply move from burning gas to electrification of these heating processes. Heating appliances tend to last longer than cars. So typically an equipment has a life of 10 to 30 years. So it'll take a little longer to retire many of those items, but we can start now. And importantly, many of these will retire in the next 10 years. So every decision we make in the next 10 years ought to be considering a move away from oil and fuel and gas to electrification. So in summary, we have the technologies to address emissions reductions in electricity, transport and heating. And with ambition, we can make deep cuts by 2030. In doing so, we will make the next stage of getting to net zero more achievable. And I'd like to hand over now to John, who will tell us a little bit more about the policy structures that will take us there. Thank you.
Thanks, Renata. As chair of the ATSE's Energy Forum, I'm really pleased to be here today to take part in this presentation of what I think is a very important statement by ATSE. I'd like to also quickly mention that I wanted to thank all the members of the Energy Forum who have worked hard to get the language of this statement right. Now, Hugh spoke about the unequivocal scientific evidence that greenhouse gas emissions are changing the Earth's climate. It's increasingly clear that business as usual is no longer an option. That approach is going to threaten Australia's biodiversity, our ecosystems, human health, our water resources, food security, and so on. The negative effects on climate change on our society, as Hugh alluded to, are clear, and similarly also for our economy. Without ambitious action to reduce our emissions, those impacts are only going to get worse as time goes on. Fortunately, as Renata pointed out, we already have the technologies that we need to reduce our emissions, particularly from sectors that are contributing the most to our emissions right now, those sectors of electricity, stationary energy, and transport. What is missing, though, is a national policy commitment to net zero emissions and an implementation framework to enable a smooth and coordinated transition to achieve that objective. ATSE believes that Australia should definitely have such a policy and establish such a framework. Importantly, the framework needs to aim to fast-track emissions reductions up to the period to 2030. Doing so is going to be crucial if Australia is to have any sort of realistic hope of reaching net zero by 2050. Having a policy and a framework would provide a clear path for planning Australia's future. It would provide a lot of more certainty for industry and help to enable a technology-led transition towards net zero emissions. Now, this is not anything controversial. State and territory governments, businesses, industry associations have already adopted such targets and are calling for them. Countries around the world are also calling on Australia to ramp up on what they are claiming to be or identifying as unambitious targets. I would add that a recent nationwide poll found that a majority of voters in every single federal seat believe that federal government should do more to tackle global warming. Now, of course, we recognise that Australia's transition to net zero emissions will have impacts on society and the economy. Some existing industries will be disrupted, and there will be implications for some elements of Australia's workforce. Therefore, it's going to be important that planning and coordinating the transition to net zero includes strong community engagement, consultation, and outreach to ensure that there's good understanding of and support for the transition. And I think I take heart from the fact that the community and businesses are already well on the path to achieving that. The engagement needs to be open, transparent, and two-way. We need to allow individuals, businesses, and communities to contribute and make sure that Australia's more vulnerable citizens are not left behind in this transition. Now, as I mentioned, there will be economic costs associated with the transition. However, the economic costs of continuing along our current path are probably far greater. In fact, I read some recent modelling that suggested that the cost of doing nothing would be close to $3.5 trillion. That's a lot of money. The good news is that Australia is very well placed to benefit from a transition to net zero emissions. We have great strengths in R&D and low emissions technologies, and we have excellent natural resources, both in terms of minerals and in terms of renewable energy, that give us the potential to be a global renewable energy superpower. The fact that a number of countries are already entering into agreements with Australia to to look at ways to export our renewable energy through technologies such as hydrogen demonstrates that possibility of exporting our renewable energy is a real one. Anyway, Australia's transition to net zero is certainly not easy. It will require some work, and ATSE stands ready to work with the government, with the industry, research organisations, and the other Australian academies to support the transition in whatever way we can. I think myself and my colleagues are happy to take some questions.
Excellent, thank you for that, John. So yes, there is now an opportunity to ask questions of any of the speakers. You can ask questions by typing your question into the Q&A box or raise your hand and we will unmute you. For those of you who have joined us over the phone, if you do wish to ask a question, raise your hand by pressing *9 on your dial pad and we will unmute you. So we can kick things off with a question from David Mills from News Corp. So he'd like to know, Renata, interested in your comments on home heating and the fact that heaters have a longer life than cars. How do you suggest Australian homes be encouraged to move from gas to electricity? What policy settings should governments put in place?
Yes, certainly heating is a big cost for people in their homes, and it probably in more vulnerable homes, it's even more important. Because the nature of stationary energy means that the appliances actually have a longer lifetime, whereas obviously a moving car has challenges with longevity. Many heaters are sometimes they're built in, and there's been historically there was quite a push around cheap gas and gas being supplied to many homes, so which has left us with quite a lot of embedded gas heating and oil heating in homes or gas heating in homes. So certainly policy settings around that, and I might let John speak to this as well, but to begin with, I would say all new builds there should be no gas supplied to new builds, and there are quite a few state governments who are already taking that position and councils. Incentives or mechanisms around supporting the transition, so to allow people to buy low-cost electrification of heat. So, and some of the most cost-effective heating now is reverse cycle air conditioning, which also then gives you a payoff in summer too, and that you have a cooling process as well. John, would you like to speak on policy?
Sure. I mean, I guess, just on one other aspect of it, the other way of dealing with heating needs is energy efficiency, and improving the energy efficiency of homes is an important way to actually reduce energy consumption, to reduce the demand for energy. I know there are many natural gas companies who are exploring the use of the potential for injecting hydrogen into their networks in order to sort of green the network, the gas network, if you like, and that's something that it could become an important contributor to the solution. But policies like, as Renata alluded to, policies like incentives to switch from natural gas to electricity, they're important. I mean, it's an expensive piece of kit to central heating. Or gas heating or some of that, or electric heating. So, and there are many people who may not be able to afford to do that easily. Hugh, do you want to add anything?
No, John, I think you and Renata have covered it. It will obviously require some sort of government policy to encourage people to move off their existing gas heating systems. But as Renata says, eventually their efficiencies will drive that themselves. It's a question of accelerating it.
Brilliant, thanks guys. I have another question here from Ellen Fidian at Cosmos Magazine. What role do you see natural gas playing in our transition to net zero, noting that it still emits CO2?
John, I think you should address this.
Well, the natural gas is clearly being touted as a transition fuel, but I think at the end of the day, the IEA has said we shouldn't be developing more natural gas, more fossil fuel resources if we're going to have any chance of reaching net zero emissions by 2050. That doesn't mean that gas won't continue to be used, because the gas is there, the infrastructure is there. The plan should be to effectively reduce gas demand over time and transition to electricity that's renewable, produced by renewable energy.
Can I just add that one of the things with gas infrastructure and generation is that if people are planning their payback periods on 20 to 30 years, then really those projects are uneconomic, because within a decade or so, renewables will actually make those costly and ineffectual economically.
It's interesting also, I saw that some analysis recently of of the proposed new power plant, gas-fired power plant, and some analysis that suggested it might only operate for 2% of the time. And a plant that operates 2% of the time, it's going to struggle to make money, particularly even more so when, as Hugh says, it may not be operating at all within 10 years' time.
Brilliant, thanks guys. And question here from Jason Pertl from ABC. Question for Renata. Could you expand on your comments about the 80% renewable electrification by 2030? Is that referring to rooftop solar or also utilities?
Thank you for the clarification. It does cover both rooftop and utility scale solar. And wind. So we put in 7 gigawatts of renewable energy last year, 3 gigawatts on rooftops, 1 gigawatt of utility scale solar and 3 gigawatts of wind. And if we maintain that momentum, then we will get to 80% of the current electricity needs by 2030. At the same time, we want to encourage a transition from of transport and process heat to electrification. That will actually grow our electricity demands. So we do actually have to do better than our 7 gigawatts a year to be able to cover our current demand plus what we would see transition to electrification by 2030. And the calculations say we need about 14 gigawatts a year of renewables over the next 10 years to on average to get there. But we can do 7 gigawatts a year this year, and that's up from, I'd have to cross-check the numbers, but it's effectively doubled every 3 years. So it's possible for us to maintain that momentum and to get to an average of 14 gigawatts and to be delivering all of that electrification by 2030. We can do it.
It's interesting because if I can just add, the forecasts that have been coming out, they're constantly being exceeded. The forecasts of renewable energy penetration are constantly being exceeded. A little bit like the forecast of energy price declines. Also, the prices for things like photovoltaic panels and batteries and so on and so forth, they're all dropping in price, and they're all seem to be dropping faster than the forecasters are predicting. So I think there are promising signs.
Yeah. So from my perspective, you're right. We can do it. That sort of we have the capacity to grow at the rate that we do. There are engineering hurdles and market operation hurdles that have to be managed. So we need to have the grid ready to handle this significant two-way flow of power, and we need the market operator who is ready. They are readying themselves for this very diverse, very interesting market, very different to what we've had historically. But they're engineering solutions. It's not new science. We need to start moving on engineering and policy solutions. We need to start moving on them.
Yep.
Thank you. And a question here from Rod Taylor, ACM Freelance. He says, while you've already said we already have technology solutions, where are the major gaps? What would you say are the priorities for research?
So this is me. I run a research program in photovoltaics or in solar at the University of New South Wales. There is still interesting technology development in photovoltaics itself, and that's part of what drives down the price, continues to drive down the price. The technology in solar panels has literally transformed in the last 5 years, and it will continue to transform, and the prices will continue to drop. Battery technologies are changing because you need, and evolving, because we need different kinds of batteries. We need high power, short duration batteries, like in a car, to get it moving quickly, to move a large load quickly, same with trucks. And then we need long lifetime storage, like we would get from pumped hydro, where if we have days in a row with low sunshine and low wind speeds, then you need this long battery, long storage. So those sort of technologies are being developed, invested in, and growing. Once we get to 2030, and if we go down this path and we've addressed a large amount of our emissions, there will still be a gap to get to net zero by 2050. And there are technologies that we will need to invest in and do research on and address to get us there. And that will include green hydrogen. So hydrogen to mix as a fuel itself, as an export, hydrogen as an export, or ammonia as an export. So we can use all our fabulous renewable energy resources in Australia and export a clean hydrogen solution. And then there's the minerals processing, such as green aluminium and green steel, that we would want to be transitioning our industries to deliver on those processes using renewable energy, which will make us competitive in international markets and will in fact grow our opportunity in international markets with these products. And there's a bunch of research that needs to be done in those areas.
Brilliant. John or Hugh, would you like to add anything to that?
I think Renata's covered it pretty comprehensively from my perspective.
I'm fine.
Brilliant, thank you. David has another question from News Corp. He said, this might be a bit of a random question, but in the graph of our GHG emissions, I saw there was a big dip in the mid-1990s. What were we doing then?
That's an excellent question. I'm going to pass that to John or Renata, because I don't know, but I suspect it's more about what was happening then than what we were doing then. John?
Look, around that time was when we started having talk about carbon prices and things like that. So that may have played a role in it. I'm not specifically sure. I think one of the problems has been the changing nature of Australian industry as well. That's sort of driven an increase in emissions. For example, LNG plants are quite high emitters. Renata?
No, I'm not. I don't think I can answer that. I do think that we have had a significant growth in gas and usage, and since the 1990s. You'll see that the graph goes up and down. So we peaked in 2005, and then we started to drop again, and then we flattened off. We've lost a sort of an opportunity in the last 10 years to make a significant difference. We've just seen a small dip again in the last in the COVID years. So yeah, it's a lot of it is to do with policy and politics as much as energy consumption.
Thank you for that. Another question from James. For a 50% cut to emissions by 2030, what proportion of the national fleet would need to be electronic vehicles? Thoughts on how to achieve this?
Renata, do you know the numbers on that?
Sorry, can you just please ask the question again?
Sure, no problem. So he's just asking, just get it again.
What proportion of the fleet do we need to shift? Sorry,
here we are.
Yeah, would be tough to. Okay, ask again. We'll see.
Sure. Yeah. For a 50% cut to emissions by 2030, what proportion of the national fleet would need to be electronic vehicles? Any thoughts on how to achieve this?
So I can't, with confidence, answer the specific question around what proportion, but I would say 50%. But I'm happy to take that on notice and go back and get the numbers and come back to you. What policy? There are lots of examples around the world for policies that encourage the uptake of electric vehicles. One is you could start by removing the luxury tax on electric vehicles. There are others who provide an incentive, and in some of our states have actually added an incentive to electric vehicle purchases. We need to make it easier to charge electric vehicles, so we need more charging stations, and there is a lot of initiative going on in that space at the moment. For the record, I'm the owner of an electric vehicle and I've had one for 4 months and I love it. And I'd be very happy to talk about details about that too. So there are other parts of the world that offer free parking to electric vehicles, toll-free driving to electric vehicles. What we do need to avoid is additional barriers to electric vehicles. We need to find ways to, and it might be that we need to change the way we tax vehicles for road use. We currently tax vehicles. There is a charge for that makes its way to roads on petrol. So it might be that we need to change that way that is taxed, but we need to do it across the board, not just pick charge for electric vehicles. If we just need to change the way we tax, if we're going to have a reduced fuel excise, and we need to support our road infrastructure. So that's what I can say about policies and electric vehicles. I'm not sure if John or Hugh would like to add anything to that.
I think you hit the ball, the nail on the head. Really, the important here to look at incentives and not barriers. And I think singling out electric vehicles to have road user charges applied to them is a barrier. Even if the amount that suppose they claim to be collected is relatively minor, what put in place anything that sort of discourages people from buying them? That at some point, obviously, as sales of fuel internal combustion engine cars drops off, there will be an impact on revenue collection because you're not collecting the fuel excise. That money goes into general revenue. Some of it goes to roads. I don't suspect not an awful lot compared to how much is collected, but at some point there would be some sort of argument for road user charges. That could solve other problems too, I suppose, in terms of congestion pricing and those things of that nature. But now is probably not the time to sort of do that exclusively on electric vehicles, in my personal view.
I actually personally think that we could introduce usage-based charging for the roads for all vehicles relatively quickly, even existing vehicles, by using what's called an OBD2 dongle. It's a little dongle that costs about $20 that you plug it into a port that all modern cars have, and that would be able to record road usage. And at the same time, it would also be a platform for the introduction of vehicle-to-vehicle communications, which will then give tremendous added safety benefits and more effective usage of the road. So this is the time to be thinking of that switchover, but it's not particularly popular in certain sectors of the economy.
Excellent, thank you for that. Another question from Rod at ACM. He'd like to know, should we have a price on carbon?
Can I have a go at this, and I'll let John and Renata respond after me. We ATSE as an academy has resisted the notion of supporting a carbon price because there's a certain illogicality in it that it's very difficult to actually price carbon appropriately. What we do think is that there should be caps on emissions, and that we should level the playing field by ensuring that all forms of energy generation are actually capped at the same level, so that creates an incentive for the market to decide what's the most appropriate technology evolution path. John?
I guess Australian businesses and particularly exporters are going to be exposed to a carbon price ultimately, one way or the other, because if we don't change the way where our targets for emission reductions, then our trading partners have made it pretty clear that they're going to impose some form of carbon tax border adjustment mechanism, or whatever it's called, which will, effectively make exporters of products with embedded emissions in them pay for those emissions in one way or another. So, and it comes back to another question there I noticed from Donna Liu from The Guardian, who talked about negative emissions technologies. And it's important here, we're talking about net zero emissions, because there's lots of things that are really hard to avoid having some form of emissions. So net zero means that we can offset emissions by doing other things like, carbon sequestration, planting more trees, et cetera, and negative emissions technologies. And negative emissions technologies will probably become important, particularly if we don't do a very good job on reducing our emissions, because we'll be left with nothing much to do besides try and suck carbon out of the air. I hope it doesn't come to that, but I guess that's one of the areas where Renata talked about additional research needed. Those are the sorts of areas where you might look at doing additional research, I suspect.
And we need the cost of energy to be very low, because that's a very energy inefficient process to suck carbon out of the air and pump it underground and hope that you can lock it in there. So that's this action that we need to do in the next 10 years to electrify everything and get the price of energy down, because that will come as we go for renewables. Because once you've installed the renewables, the cost of operating them is very, very low compared to burning coal. We're going to need that very low energy cost to be able to drive all of those low emissions technologies, whether it's carbon capture and storage, green hydrogen, green steel. They all rely on a very low cost of energy from renewables.
Brilliant, thank you. And I know that we've touched on this, but I'll ask it anyway, just to make sure we get a full answer for it. Donna Liu from The Guardian, Australia would like to know, what, if any, role will negative emissions technologies play in getting Australia to net zero?
So I think John and Renata have already addressed that, but let me add that Renata showed a slide with our use of emissions, one of which was this strangely named LULUCF, which is negative emissions of about 4.something%. So it's small at the moment in terms of natural carbon reduction technologies. The new carbon reduction technologies, the ones for sucking carbon out the air, as John says, are absolutely minuscule in scale at the moment. They are absolutely no current impact, and as Renata says, expensive, both in terms of energy and dollars. So there's a long way to go if that technology is going to make any impact.
Brilliant, thanks for that. And Ellen has another question. Do you see technological or engineering opportunities for the agriculture sector to reduce emissions? And if so, where?
John, do you want to go, or should I go?
Well, I know that the agriculture sector is one of the sectors that is actually moving quite quickly. I mean, the farmers are on the front line for, seeing the effects of climate change. The Meat and Livestock Council, or MLA, has committed to a net zero emissions target and a very ambitious one. And I'm sure that they'll be looking at things like, how do they offset emissions from cattle? How do they reduce emissions from cattle? All those sorts of things. Farmers are very much on board, and I think they're already adopting technological solutions to help them address climate change. Renata?
I don't have anything to add there. I mean, it's clear that there's a synergy between the deployment, a large scale deployment of solar and wind and farming. There's quite a lot of activity already with what's called agri-voltaics, which is agriculture and photovoltaics, coexisting and offering additional benefits to farming land. But actual reduction of emissions in agriculture, I certainly agree that it's in self-interest to address them.
And I think one of the things that, and Hugh was talking about LULUCF, agriculture is one of the sectors where there are opportunities to actually reduce carbon, sort of suck carbon out of the air by tree planting and land management and things of that nature.
One area that's important is the use of fertilizers will become much more highly optimized due to agricultural technologies. And the production of fertilizers, the so-called Haber-Bosch process, consumes something like 2% of the entire world's energy. So any opportunity to both reduce demand and to improve that process, which may happen with quantum computers in the future, would have a significant impact going forward.
Brilliant, thank you.
I'm aware that the space technology is, remote sensing technology is becoming quite important because the sophistication of the satellites and the sensitivity of the satellites that are being used to monitor crop growth and the need for fertilizer or not. And that then coupled with fertilizer distribution technologies that are very specific in terms of just fertilizing particular parts of a field or certain rows or quite detailed rather than just a blanket approach of spreading fertilizer everywhere, even if it's not needed.
Excellent, thank you. So we were talking about before that we already have the technology, but of course it does seem that adopting them will require significant financial investment. How can we convince the government and businesses to adopt these technologies, especially during a pandemic where many people are struggling and maybe not thinking about the long term as much?
Well, if I might just make a comment. At the moment, we're having to spend significant sums of money on keeping people's jobs alive. And if we're going to invest public funds, then we're best off investing it in investments that have a long-term future that will not only benefit today's workers, but tomorrow's workers as well. And these technologies we're talking about will be a long-term benefit to the country. And not only that, I think business is itching to invest in these technologies, except they require the policy certainty to enable them to do that. And so I'm not sure we have to encourage investment. It's more a case of creating the policy settings that give business certainty for those investments.
That's exactly right. I think you can see this in the investment that Renata was talking about in renewable energy and the huge increase in the amount of capacity, renewable energy generation capacity being installed in Australia, both rooftops and larger solar power plants and wind power plants. That's happening because companies are deciding, and companies and consumers are deciding that it makes economic sense to do it. And the fact that the finance sector is increasingly recognizing the risks associated with climate change, this will add weight to it because companies that don't factor in those risks in their planning will be penalized by the market, I suspect. And that's partly the reason why more and more companies are coming on board with, of ASX listed companies are coming on board with net zero emissions targets.
Thank you for that. And there's a common kind of idea out there among, I guess, especially with politicians, that it's someone else's job to kind of act on this. It's not their job. Is there, in your opinion, who would be best positioned to act on ATSE's recommendations?
Well, it's a combination of public policy and private investment. But without the public policy, as we've said, the private industry won't invest. So it really is, it does behove governments to create the regulatory and policy settings that encourage this direction.
Yeah, I mean, messages are important. And the message at the moment is sounding a little lukewarm.
We're currently having a political discussion about whether or not we should continue to subsidize coal and gas-fired generation. When we're talking technology, not taxes, it's the antithesis of that. We should be investing in new technologies that give us the reliability, not taxing to support an aging and retiring technology. And
uneconomic technology as well.
Yeah, so it's certainly messaging and signals, and we need. It would be great if we had a vision and leadership, and we had a path set, and a commitment to meet it. That's that everybody could fall behind. The state governments are leading in this space, and that they have set zero emissions targets, and they're attracting investment as a result of that. They know what they want, they've defined what it's going to look like, and they're attracting investment as a result. So if we could have that more broadly, that would be great. The other challenge we face is that because there isn't this clear target that people are heading towards, we end up with a diverse set of solutions that's uncoordinated. And it's, to some extent, that's happening with rooftop solar. We have huge amounts of rooftop solar, which is behind the meter, uncoordinated. There's the market operator, the grid operators have no idea, well, limited idea of what's actually happening and where the energy generation is going to come from and how it's going to change. And they have to manage this system, which is uncoordinated. So if we had a vision and a plan, we would all be pulling in that direction. Instead, what's happening is individuals are making these investments and driving this change in an uncoordinated way. It's not super productive.
Can I just add to that, Renata, because your point about solar behind the meters, one of the real issues as well is the lack of policy means that the distributors have no incentive to upgrade their networks. So I wanted to put solar on my house. I needed 5 kilowatts, and I was constrained by the distributor to 3.5 kilowatts because they didn't want to upgrade their transformers in the village. So, it's this sort of policy setting that is holding us back rather than letting us go forward.
Yeah, and as I made in my opening remarks, at the comment I made there, this sort of a policy and framework is not controversial with the vast majority of the Australian population and business and research organizations. It's not like, it's interesting, it's not like, what are the electorate? It's not like there'd be a huge backlash against a policy of this kind. It's what everyone else is kind of doing, and there's this one big lacking element to it.
Thank you for that. And another question for you. So building all of this new technology or creating that infrastructure is likely to have substantial carbon costs before having the benefits, we've been told. So the idea that we can invent our way out of this to stop our the fact that it's stopping our government making efforts to curb existing emissions, is that whole approach flawed? Is that argument that you hear sometimes that the building of these technologies have carbon costs, is that idea flawed as well? Yeah, just kind of a big question for you.
Are you asking, is the risk unacceptable? Because if you are, the risk of waiting for unproven technologies that may or may not mature, like hydrogen, is much greater. You're far better off using that, and that's the point of the segment that Renata spoke to. Is the point of the segment is the technologies we can use to actually make significant progress are here today. we don't have to take risks, and their economics are proven as well. So it's not a case of, you know, waiting for some miracle to happen. It's a case of getting on with it now. I don't believe in miracles.
So most of those of us working in solar, at least, are always looking at the life cycle carbon costs, and the solar technologies pay back within a year or two now for their embodied carbon. My point over the next 10 years is that every time we retire something, we should invest in the low carbon equivalent. It doesn't mean, I'm not saying, I don't think any of us are saying shut down the power stations, turn on the renewable energy sources. It's manage a transition, have a plan, and work your way through it. So all the other infrastructure, which also has an embodied carbon content, we need to manage that out, and manage, as we make those decisions in the future, make a decision which is to electrify the process and to use renewable energy. And that trend, if we do it, if we're proactive about it, if we really they're considered decisions over the next 10 years, we can make a really significant impact. And then it makes the next 20 years a whole lot easier. Everything is much more achievable if you're halfway there.
Yeah, that's exactly right. We have lost a lot of time. We could have been much further down the path if we had had a more planned and structured approach to reducing our emissions, and started some time ago.
Brilliant, thank you for that. And I just have one last question. So if Jonas, if you have any additional questions, please make sure to get them in now before I close up. But one last question for you from me anyway. Geoengineering has been discussed as a way to manipulate the climate, but many scientists see it as a last resort because the impacts aren't well known. So do you think we're already at that point where geoengineering is or will soon be necessary?
It's hard to tell, but it could be. I mean, look, geoengineering is a very low-cost way, in fact, if you look at it, it's counterintuitively of reducing the temperature. But as you say, the consequences are unknown, and it's hotly contested, and it's very difficult to do a small-scale trial to actually determine what the impact will be. So, yes, are we at 1 minute to midnight? Probably. Should we apply that? Gee, I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think it's one of those areas where, if you want to talk about risk, there's a big risk, because we don't know exactly how it would work. It's also a lot of those geoengineering technologies. They're hard to reverse. You sort of apply that, and you find it doesn't work. It's very hard to turn around and undo it.
I think it's easier to get sulfur dioxide out of the atmosphere than carbon dioxide, though. So the timescales are less. But you're right, John. I mean, the unknown consequences and how you get rid of them if they're wrong is hard to tell.
I hope we don't get to the point where we have to resort to that to try and save the planet.
If we recognise the risk is great enough to be looking at geoengineering, we ought to be able to act more quickly right now with what we can do right now.
Yeah.
It doesn't, from my perspective, it's invest in what we can do now, and and because we
avoiding
can make
the need for it.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, avoid the need for it. I mean, yeah.
Brilliant, thank you so much. Well, that seems to be all the questions. So I'll just close up now. That's it for today's event, everyone. A reminder that this story is under embargo until 1 minute past midnight on Thursday, the 2nd of September. A full recording of today's presentations will be available on Cymex shortly. To get in contact with any of our speakers, especially with those questions that may need a little bit more background information, please contact the ATSE Communications Manager, Liz Foskier. You can get her on liz.foskier, that's liz.foschia at atse.org.au. You can also call her on 0419 976 903. Feel free to contact us directly at the Science Media Centre if you do have any specific requests or questions as well. You can get us on 0871208666, or you can email info@smc.org.au. Thank you so much to all of today's speakers, and thank you everyone for joining us for this online briefing.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.